I don't know if you people here watch as much TV as I do. Not that I watch a lot of TV, but I watch enough that one of the things that I remember most about TV are the commercials. And one of the commercials that's been on quite a bit lately is a Midas muffler commercial. And it depicts a guy who wants to work for Midas, the top guns. And so they give him a run through and see how well he can do his job. And then at the end of his little thing, he's supposed to be a fast, good muffler repairman. But they make a fool of him at the end because he did the job fast, but he didn't do it good. The pipes were loose. And so just before he leaves with these words, "You are number one on my list." In other words, I'll get you back. Revenge. And this is something that the Apostle Paul instructs the Roman believers that we are not to do. We are not to take revenge against people who do evil to us. And our passage this morning is Romans chapter 12, verses 17 to 21. Let's begin reading. He says, "Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." You know, the unsaved world, and I believe Paul here is dealing with believers doing evil, unbelievers doing evil to believers. And I believe he's talking about it on a fairly large scale, if we could say that, because in the next chapter he deals with evil being done to believers, and that we are to allow the courts and civil authorities to deal with it. And so, just for the sake of everyday living, for application this morning, I want to look at this as in principle, the principle of not rendering evil in exchange for evil in our daily lives, whether it be to unbelievers or to believers that even do evil to us. And one of the greatest opportunities we have as Christians to shine for Christ is in the face of opposition, in the midst of evil being done to us. The unbeliever expects us to react to evil in a certain way. They expect us to react naturally. And the natural reaction of an unbeliever who reacts to evil is to repay with evil. But the believer is not to repay evil in exchange for evil. In verses 17 and 18, Paul talks to us in principles. He gives us principle here. In verse 19, he talks about a prerogative. And in verses 20 and 21, he deals with practices and a prospect. Let's consider verses 17 and 18, the principles. He says, "Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men." Let me ask you a question. When's the last time you've ever gotten even with someone? When's the last time the thought of, "I'll get you back," has entered into your mind? Well, you know, if you're married, it may have entered into your mind this morning, or last night, or last week. Did you sew those pants like I asked you? No. Fine, we're not going out tonight. That's getting even. It is. It's repaying evil in exchange for evil. And we're not to do that. Christians do it to Christians. Christians do it to non-Christians. But in this context, we're dealing with a Christian and a non-Christian. or the Christian against the non-Christian world, or I should say the other way around. But he says, don't repay evil for evil. At the same time, he says, provide things honest in the sight of all men. This is the unbelieving world looking in on us. And the thought is that while we don't repay evil in exchange for evil, we are taking thought for good things, or he says, honest things, or things honorable. And the word that Paul uses here is a word that means, in essence, good. The word for honest, he says, provide things honest. And that has to deal with exterior goodness which is seen. It's an outward expression of goodness that stems from within us. But it's the goodness that people will see. In other words, he says, when evil is done to us, we're to take thought that the unbelieving world will watch us, watch our reaction, and see how we're going to react. And we have to provide, or we have to take thought and provide an honest answer to the evil done to us. And the honest answer, because we are Christians, is not to repay evil with evil, but is to provide a consistent testimony. Now, maybe you don't understand what I'm trying to say. When we're wronged, and I've noticed this a lot at work, when I'm wronged at work, or when I'm ridiculed, or whatever, I have to bear in mind that to get even is not consistent with a Christian testimony. So I'm not providing what the unbeliever would consider an honest view of what I really am. It doesn't go with what I profess to be, and that is good, okay? Intrinsically good because I'm a Christian, because Christ lives in me. But if I give him something else, he will say, that is not I'm not providing things honest. I'm giving a wrong picture. And this is exactly in 1 Peter 2:12 what Peter says that we are supposed to do. He encourages these believers. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your behavior honest, same word, honest or good among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. So Peter is saying, let the outward expression, your manner of life, conform to and be an honest representation of what you are as a Christian, a child of God. In 2 Corinthians 8:21, Paul takes careful thought, and Mike went through chapters 8 and 9, so I think we'll remember a bit of the context. He says in verse 20 and 21, avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. How do you react? Let's say, how do you react in the workplace, where the place is filled with unbelievers, where it really doesn't matter, or so it seems, how you react to something or to someone that wrongs you? You know, a lot of people, a lot of Christians, divorce their Christianity from their jobs. They leave Christ at home and go to work. It's very easy when you're wronged in a place of unbelievers to get back, to get even, to repay evil for evil. You know, just because there are no other Christians watching you doesn't make it right. No. Paul exhorted the Philippians in chapter 1. He said, only let your conduct or your manner of life be as it becomes the gospel of Christ. Be consistent in your testimony. Non-Christians are on the lookout and are very sensitive to how we react. Look at Daniel, for example. Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. The testimony that Daniel had before Nebuchadnezzar. And what was Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to Daniel's response to the evil that was done to him? The Philippian jailer in Philippians chapter 16. Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown into prison. They didn't repay evil for evil. And what was the response of the Philippian jailer who watched all of this? It wasn't negative. He got saved. And what about Paul and Stephen? Did Stephen repay evil for evil? No. And what was the reaction of Paul? Paul got saved. I have a good illustration of this principle from work. A couple of years ago, there was this older fellow that I liked. And I'd go into the lunchroom and he'd be sitting there with his back to me, and I'd go up to him and I'd pat him on the back here, and how you doing, Mike? And he'd jump and he'd get scared. And, don't do that to me. Okay, fine. I thought I startled him there for the first time. Next day, he's sitting there. I come in late as usual. I did the same thing. I liked him. Slap him on the back. How you doing, Mike? Well, he got really upset. And he never talked to me the rest of the shift. We were on a 4-day stretch of days off. And I went in after 3 or 4 days to work 3 to 11. And I wasn't in our we call it a shack. I wasn't in the shack for more than 5 minutes, and I got a phone call. I answered the phone, and it was the general foreman. Yeah, what can I do for you? I hear you've been roughing up Mike. Well, I said, no, it's not true. He said, well, I don't know what game you've got going with Mike, but you've bruised him. Wait, yeah, I said, Mike doesn't like me. And so I thought that this was a tremendous evil done to me. And so I was offended because I liked the guy. And I didn't know that he would go behind my back and turn me in. I could have got demerit points. And so I thought about it for a while, and I said, okay, what's my reaction going to be now? And it didn't take me long to realize that I had the greatest opportunity of my career at the steel plant to prove what I was. And so I did not react in the natural way. It just so happened that Mike was on the job that I needed him for and he needed me for. But we didn't have to work together. We could work independent, but without talking or whatever. And so I had a helper, and Mike was down below. It's hard to explain. But anyway, I finished my job, and my young helper had known all that went on the phone, and he just couldn't believe that this happened. He thought that I should just go and right there and give it to Mike. But he just watched me. And so I finished doing what I had to do, and I went right down and I said, Mike, can I give you a hand? Oh, can you give me a hand? No, it's okay. Okay, fine. So I went upstairs, and my young helper said, this doesn't make sense. He turns you in, and you go down and you say, can I give you a mind about the Lord because of that incident. That really solidified in his mind what I was. I didn't repay evil for evil, but I provided an honest testimony of what I was. And he watched every little bit of it. But how far can we carry this principle of not repaying evil for evil? Well, Paul says in verse 18, if it be possible, as much as lies in you. There, the onus is on us. As much as lies in us, we are to live peaceably with all men, and that includes Mike, doesn't it? And the onus was on me. As much. That's to the extent to which we are to go. As much as lies in us, we are to live peaceably. And so we're not to repay evil for evil because of the divine prerogative of verse 19. Paul says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And the word that Paul uses for avenge and vengeance come from the same word, which means, it comes from the word ekdikasis, and it means out of justice, or something that proceeds out of justice. And you know, man can really not do anything out of justice, because man is not a just person. Only God is perfectly just. And so what God does stems from justice. So to say that vengeance belongs to us really isn't right, because it doesn't stem from justice, perfect justice. And so in verse 19, what Paul may be doing here is answering a possible objection to what some people may be saying. Okay, Paul, you say don't get even with these people, don't stop them, let their wickedness go. Wouldn't it be better to just stop them in their tracks forcibly and stop all this wickedness that's being done to us? Paul says, no, don't avenge yourselves with the evildoers, but rather give place unto wrath. But what wrath is he talking about? Now, to recompense evil for evil, that's wrath. And he says, don't avenge yourself, but give place to wrath. But what wrath is he talking about? Whose wrath is he talking about? Well, there may be four possibilities. Maybe. Maybe he's talking about the wrath of our adversary. If there's going to be a place for wrath, then let it be the wrath of the guy who's bothering you, not your wrath. Give it a place. Let him do what he wants to do. Maybe it could be our wrath. Maybe he's saying, give it a place, but not here. Let your wrath go, but give it time, or give it a little bit here, a little bit there. Or maybe it's the wrath that he refers to that God gives to the civil authorities to dish out in verses 4 and 5. For he is the minister of the next chapter. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, an avenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Maybe that's whose wrath it is. But I think more conclusively, the apostle is talking about the wrath of God. Simply because Paul's use of the word orge, or wrath, is predominantly, throughout the New Testament, the wrath of God. And secondly, I think it is because it fits the context and it is supported by the appeal to the Scriptures. Give place unto wrath, because it is written, vengeance belongs to me. I will repay, says the Lord. And Paul quotes from the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy. Vengeance is the divine prerogative. We have no business. We have no business doing it. It belongs to God. And so, we have the principle, we have the divine prerogative, and now we come to the practice, the practical aspect of it. Paul says, wraps it up a little bit. Therefore, if your enemy hungers, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. This reminds me of the Lord's words in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. I'll read it for you. The Lord said, you have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other side. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would not borrow of thee, turn not thou away. You have heard that it has been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. And so what are we to do? We are to even go as far as to fulfill the needs, the desperate needs of our enemies when they come to us for help. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. The effect of repaying good here for evil is like heaping coals of fire on their heads. Now, what on earth does that mean? That sounds like we're taking vengeance, doesn't it? If I poured hot coals on anybody's head here, that's not going to be like I'm feeding them or giving them drink, is it? Well, some have said that the effect of treating your enemy like a brother gives them a sense of shame and remorse, and it's like a burning sense of shame and remorse that sears their conscience, that gives them a hard time in their head. Hey, I'm his enemy and he's doing this to me. But that's almost like taking vengeance on them, isn't it? So it doesn't fit. But I think the culture of the day will help us determine what the effect is like here. In Bible times, and even in today, the only heat that the people have in their houses was burning coals of charcoal in a thing called a brazier or a clay pot. And they use this for the heat for the house and to cook on. And if the coals of fire in these pots ever went out, a person in the family would have to go to a neighbor's house and ask, and this was the practice of the day, and ask if they could have some live coals put in their pot. And if the neighbor was a generous, loving neighbor, she wouldn't just put enough in for them to get their coals going. But if she was a generous and loving neighbor, she would heap the pot full. And like every good Oriental person, they would walk home with it on their heads. And so Paul says, if your enemy hungers, feed him. If he thirsts, give him drink. In so doing, you'll heap coals of fire on their heads. You will be supplying a desperate need. That's not vengeance. And if I went to my enemy and I said, or an enemy came to me, or an evildoer that did me wrong just 2 minutes ago, and he comes to me and he knocks on my door and he says, I got no coals, can you give me some? I fill him right up. Fill him right up. It'll have an effect on him. Just like the effect that I had on Mike when I went down and I said, Mike, can I give you a hand? I was heaping coals of fire on his head. I don't think he ever forgot that. Give me a hand. And in so doing, there is a prospect for us. In verse 21, Paul says, stop being overcome by evil. But, on the other hand, overcome evil with good. This is a tremendous prospect. We can overcome evil by the good that is in us, by the good that is done by us. And that's the way God is. That's the way God reacts to evil. And the greatest example of God's reaction to evil men is the cross. God should sweep us all into hell. He should. Vengeance belongs to him. But he didn't. No. He repaid good for evil. And in the future, the evil will be overcome. And so on a lesser scale, we have a job to do. We have to overcome evil with good. And so I take this passage and apply it to a lot of the things that happen to me at work. It's very natural for me to want to repay, get even. Everybody does it. Everybody does. I've seen men at work go through a lot of trouble, a lot of work to make it worse for the other guy. Work that he doesn't have to do. But if it will do something to the other guy to make him miserable, he'll go right ahead.